Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Supply Chain Schools Business Bytes from the Homes Leadership Group on how the housing sector is rising to the challenge of zero carbon. My name is James Cadman. I'm going to be your host and chair for the day, and we've got an hour and a half of interesting presentations and conversations around net zero and carbon and other associated sustainability impacts. A few key practical issues first of all. If I could ask all participants, all attendees to have your microphones and cameras off, that would be really helpful. We're using Zoom as the platform today because we've got several speakers and we've decided it's the best platform for doing that. We do have our standard chat function, like in any webinar. If you have a question, do go into the chat box and put in your comment or question, and we'll try our best to get through as many of those as we can through the course of the afternoon. This is our schedule for the day, for the afternoon, sorry. I'm just trying to remove this up here. We have a great selection of speakers to show to you today, to share with you today. Before we get into that, we're going to do a quick polling of you guys in the audience with a few key questions on your position and your current action in and around climate change, carbon and net zero. Once we've done that, we're going to hear from the House Builders Federation, then three of the UK's largest house builders before we break for a panel Q&A. And then we're going to go into two supplier presentations from Adaptivate and Aggregate Industries before we conclude with a second panel Q&A and some final concluding remarks. So, some house rules. As I say, if you're a participant, please have your camera off and obviously your microphones off as well. But do get involved in our polling questions that we're going to do with you in a few minutes, as well as using the chat box for any other questions. We will be seeking your feedback at the end of the session. We're going to circulate a link where you can go in and provide your feedback on the event. And we are recording this session for anyone who wants to play it back or share it with colleagues. And likewise, the slides will be shared as well. So if you want to take notes, by all means do so, but the slides will be shared. Okay, so polling the audience. We're going to use a software platform called Mentimeter. Some of you will have used this before if you've been on school events or other webinars before. It's a simple platform for getting views, opinions and ideas off an audience. So you'll need your smartphone and just open up a web browser tab on that, or another tab on your laptop browser. We do recommend Chrome rather than Microsoft. Chrome seems to work better with this platform than others. Go to menti.com, not Mentimeter. You have the shorter version, menti.com. And you can see I took a screen grab of my phone earlier, and that's what it should look like when you get it up on your phone. It simply gives you a box to enter a PIN code, a 7-digit PIN code, and then you submit it. That's all you have to do. So as long as you've got a connection to the internet, you should be able to get in. Do stay in the Zoom webinar. Don't disconnect from this inadvertently. They run separately. They run in parallel. So we're going to do that in a minute. Okay, so just to go briefly through our panel of speakers, we've got John Slaughter, who is Director of External Affairs at the House Builders Federation. And John's going to take us through the environmental strategy from the HBF and the roadmap for the house building sector over the next few years. And then we've got three speakers from some of the largest house builders in the UK. We've got Ian Heisman, Director of Sustainability at Taylor Wimpey, and then Sarah Pratt, Head of Corporate Sustainability at Barrett Developments, and last but not least, Andrew Day, Sustainability Director of Telford Homes. And they'll each be giving you a flavour of their strategies for net zero and carbon over the coming years and how those are interwoven with other sustainability impacts. You'll get a very good flavour of what these key businesses are doing around these issues. Then we'll have a panel Q&A, take some questions from the audience and discuss some of the topics that have been brought to light before we then move into our two supplier speakers. Tom Robinson, Managing Director at Adaptivate, will be talking about their innovative low carbon dry lining and plaster products. And then finally, Joanne Wilkinson, Area Manager at Aggregate Industries, talking about their low carbon cement and concrete products and how those are literally forming the foundation of a lot of low carbon buildings going forward. So quite a packed agenda. Do get involved, do make your comments and questions. And as you see in the chat box, my colleague Sophie's already put up the pin number for Mentimeter. So, time to get your phone or your other browser tab open for Mentimeter. I'm just going to change screen. I see some people have already been ahead of the game. Well done. So, what you should be able to see now live is the first question. Does your organisation have a carbon strategy? Yes, no, or don't know. It's quite binary. Well, there's three things, but you know what I mean. Yes, no, or don't know. So we'll give you a few seconds to get into that and to answer your question, ask your question. Okay, so we've got almost 100 people. Excellent. Right, I'm going to give you a, cancel that one, sorry. I'm going to give you a 10-second countdown. So I understand our gate figures are, we've got 166 people today in attendance, which is really good. Excellent. So over 3/4 of you have got a carbon reduction strategy. That's really good to hear. Some of you are not too sure and some of you haven't, but that is really good from our point of view that everyone is getting the message and developing a strategy. Okay, next question. Has your organisation set a commitment to be net zero by 2050 or earlier maybe, and or set a science-based target? Okay, so slightly lower numbers there. So almost half of you have set some kind of commitment to be net zero. So you've got a strategy, but not quite moved all of you towards the situation of having a commitment to be net zero by a certain date. But that's the next logical step on from a reduction strategy. So we're all on the right journey. We're all on the right path. Cool. Okay. Question 3. What are the biggest risks from climate change that your organisation faces? So this is asking you to do a word cloud. So type in a few words that you think are relevant to your situation, the biggest risks from climate change, both in terms of your business, but physical risks as well. They could be financial risks, whatever you think is appropriate. Okay, so we're seeing physical risks of flooding and weather changes. We're seeing financial costs, regulatory issues as well, which is a big cost as well, both time and admin. Well, you're busy people today, well done. Lots coming in, supply chain, lack of government direction maybe, knowledge as well, so lots going on, lots of issues. What this says for me that it's multifaceted. There's no one key issue and there's no one solution either. Unfortunately, this is not like the ozone hole where there was a key issue and there was a fairly key solution in terms of CFCs. This is a lot more complicated. Okay, cool. Give you 10 seconds for any final thoughts. Supply chain is coming up a lot and raw material availability. What are the materials that are actually going to get us there in terms of low carbon? No, that's really good. Excellent, thank you, people. And we'll be sharing this part as well, these outputs as well, as part of the documentation that we send on afterwards. Okay, next question. What are the barriers preventing you from addressing the risks and making a change? So you've just given us the indication of what you see as those key issues, those problems, those risks from climate change and the impacts it has, but what's stopping you making a change? What's stopping you becoming net zero, for example? Knowledge again, yeah, that's good. Cost barriers or Brexit. I wondered how long it would take before that word came up. COVID as well, obviously, the last 9 months have been rather testing for all of us. I'm seeing stuff about market dynamics, about demand and supply as well. That's interesting. It's who's asking for this? Where's the pull coming from? Is it a push or a pull, or is it both sides pushing equally? Budgeting costs, silo budgeting, yeah. People understanding what's going on. Interesting, those ones, obviously, you know how word clouds work. The bigger the font, the more prevalent it is in terms of your responses. So cost, technology, knowledge, Brexit, all coming out. So the knowledge, of course, the supply chain school. There are other places you can go to, but supply chain school. And then technology as well. Okay, super. Good stuff. Really useful input. Just so you know, as an aside that's related to this, the supply chain school is coming out with our member survey, our annual member survey in the next couple of weeks, which is akin to this. So do fill that in as well. That'd be useful for your feedback there. Okay, a couple more questions. Let's be more positive. We know what the risks are. What are the opportunities? We know what the barriers are, but what are the opportunities out there for us to address this? And for you, it might be the quickest, the cheapest, the biggest impact, biggest bang for your buck. What can we see? Let's see the pint pot as half full. Collaboration, yeah. Awesome specifics there about timber frame. Good. Modern methods of construction, off-site construction, yeah, doing things differently, different technologies. Innovation in electric vehicles. Definitely getting more renewable energy involved. Okay. Give you a 10-second countdown. Packaging has cropped up as well, fairly heavily. Cool. Okay, yeah, so being innovative, taking the opportunity to think about different ways of working, different systems, different materials, different forms of energy production and provision. That's all good stuff. Excellent. Okay. Who has the most influence in this space? If you'd like to rank them from 1 to 5, key stakeholders, there are other stakeholders. The font would be very small if we included every stakeholder, of course. But you know, those are 5 of the key stakeholders as we see them. Who's got the most influence, in your opinion? Okay. This is like watching the football leagues, the Premiership. Sadly, my team always seems to go only in one direction. So for those of you who haven't got this yet, in Menti you can click and hold down and push up and rearrange the different categories, the different stakeholders. Okay, we're getting up to 100 people. It seems to have settled down. Government, house builders, then customers. I'll just put a countdown on that for the rest of you. Okay. There's some interesting outcomes there, and I think our panel speakers will be able to comment on that and where that influence sits and how we can nudge it one way or the other, what we can do to influence. Okay. Cool. I think this is the final question. How much does your organization invest in innovation or research and development, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to climate change? Okay, so there's a decent spread there. There's a lot of organisations out there who do invest something when it comes specifically to climate change, whether it's in materials or in innovative ways of working, modern methods of construction, that kind of thing. But there's a big section of you who aren't sure. So maybe that's something to find out. What is the investment and what can we do more to push funding in that direction? Because clearly it's the direction that the sector's going in. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. That is the last of the questions. Let me just flip back to my slides. Super. So thank you for that. I think our speakers will find that input useful to weave into what they're going to talk about and how that kind of sets the context for what we're talking about today. I'm going to ask John Slaughter to speak first. John, as I mentioned, is Director of External Affairs at House Builders Federation, and John's going to be talking about the environmental strategy and roadmap from the APF. So John, over to you. I'll just go and stop sharing my slides and leave you to hand over for you.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I will try and find my slides. Where have they gone? There they are. And I'll put this on slideshow. Right. Okay, so really what I wanted to do was just give you a quick summary of the work that we're doing on the environmental roadmap and strategy. It's a story that goes back about 18 months to when we had a meeting at number 10 and with other senior policymakers that arose out of a series of contacts around the environmental agenda and an increasing realization on our part that there are a lot of different environmental issues that were coming towards the housing sector. And we thought that it was important that we got on the front foot with all that. This is sort of the wider context of how we came to set up a task force, which we did fairly recently to work on a roadmap. We were aware that there were some growing and important environmental challenges, and they're not ones that can be put off. We were aware on the political and governmental front that COP26 was coming towards us. Obviously, it was subsequently delayed, but we didn't know that at the time. And clearly, the Climate Change Committee is doing a lot of important work and has focused a good deal on the built environment sector. So we were very mindful of this change in the outlook from government and the political world and from the public. And we recognise that housing is a very important part of the picture, interconnects with a lot of different environmental objectives. And then within government, a lot of those are in practice siloed when seen from HBF or from member companies. You often have a conversation about one set of issues with one government department and then a different one with another government department, and the two don't necessarily join up. So putting all this together, we saw a real opportunity for the industry to get on the front foot, develop a positive roadmap and try and join things up. And we also recognised that this needed to be a collaborative journey. So very interesting how collaboration came out of the polling just now. But for us, it's an absolutely key part of the strategy. And the Future Homes Task Force has got a lot of members on it because we're trying to represent all the key stakeholders in this process. We've not got just the task force. That's met a couple of times. We've had a couple of summits which have widened engagement and been successful in raising awareness of what we want to do. But we've also held detailed workshops, which I think some of you have taken part in, involved in today's event, which we're very grateful for your input. And we've looked at the issues both in the field of the fabric of the buildings, the homes that we're going to be building in future, infrastructure and connectivity issues, and placemaking, sort of the wider environment and how we bring things together. So that input's been extremely valuable. And then on the right hand side of the slide, you can see that we've also carried out a couple of online surveys, one for house builders and one for other stakeholders. And these were based around what we saw as the key building blocks of the roadmap, the 7 issues that I've listed down here. And we asked people to identify their priorities, the opportunities, and the challenges involved in these to help inform the roadmap and the strategy we're putting together. share with you just a little bit of the feedback at the top level that we've got. And I guess the really positive news is that if you look at those 7 areas that were on the previous slide, where we've got some targets or objectives that we think are key to focus on, the general reaction, both from house builders and from other stakeholders, was we were focusing on the right set of issues. And where people thought that we hadn't quite got it right, it wasn't that there was anything major wrong with it, but really on detail, it was felt that maybe we could add or adjust certain aspects of focus. So that's in itself very encouraging. And it does mean that those 7 areas are the ones that we will focus on in bringing the final roadmap together. Looking at it from the house builder point of view, this is a kind of a little bit of feedback in terms of what people saw as the highest priority areas and the most challenging. And interestingly, from the house builders, the highest priority came out as placemaking. And in some senses, I found that a little bit counterintuitive, but when I reflected on it, I thought it was really important and encouraging, because it does show that there's a recognition about the importance of bringing all these aspects of environmental performance together and linking them into creating good quality homes and good quality developments for the future. So I think that is an important and reassuring finding. And on the challenges side, perhaps unsurprisingly, net zero is seen as being the most difficult, challenging area. And I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So the key messages so far for us are that there is general agreement that the scope of the roadmap we are looking at is one that the vast majority of house builders and others can agree with. It's recognised that there are challenges across and between many of the issues that we've identified, but also a lot of co-benefits and codependencies. And I think that's particularly true in the field of net zero, and that's an interesting and important finding. Certainly the surveys have re-emphasised, reinforced the need for collaboration across sectors, and also highlighted that there are areas that are outside the control of house builders, such as the supply chain and skills base for heat pump technology, other technology changes, potentially regulatory issues. And I guess there's a lot of issues around product and material development, which was also touched on in the answers to the poll just now. And here are a few points really in relation to the 7 areas that we are looking to focus the roadmap on. And I think it's fair to say that net zero, although we're very clear that our strategy is about more than net zero and it needs to be about more than net zero, it is a very important part of the picture. And as the house builder polling indicated, it's probably one of the most challenging ones for the industry. And that's partly because it's going to take us outside of our normal comfort zones. So the industry is well used to dealing with changes in building regulations under Part L and the regulated emissions for heating, hot water and lighting. But we don't have a roadmap on unregulated emissions for things like appliances. And we haven't, oh, sorry, I've gone ahead too quick. And we haven't got a roadmap on embodied carbon. There hasn't been a lot of work done on that on an industry-wide basis. So we probably need to start with things like data capture in the area of embodied carbon in order to take that forward. So some quite big challenges there. Climate change resilience is important, and there's a couple of issues there that we think are going to be key. Consumer issues and the potential barriers in the water efficiency and water side of things. Quite a range of issues on resource efficiency, again, some of which are more mature than others in terms of what the industry's looked at. Probably air quality is kind of more marginal in some respects from the point of view of the mainstream focus of the roadmap, but we can't ignore it. It is going to be part of the picture as well. Biodiversity, definitely important, but it needs to join up with wider environmental goals and net environmental gain ultimately, and green space, and that came through quite strongly in the feedback. And as I said earlier, placemaking is a key thing for the industry to focus on overall. And in looking at the way forward, what do we mean? What do we think a roadmap is going to be about? It's ultimately about establishing what's the reasonable contribution of the house building sector to meeting the key government climate and broader environmental objectives that are out there. And those are broadly around the 7 areas that we've talked about. And recognising that we have to work with others, so there are a lot of codependent sectors, and we need a well-structured and sequenced plan so that we can guide investment and design sustainability in from the start of the process. And we're looking at a roadmap that would consist of these 3 elements, a strong set of commitments and milestones, certainly for the next 10 to 15 years, but arguably beyond that as well. Looking at specific roadmap issues for delivery, and I'll show you in a second what that might look like in principle. And we also are thinking of setting up a delivery hub that will oversee future delivery and facilitate the kind of discussions with government and other sectors that are going to be necessary to achieve the objectives of the delivery plan and roadmap. So just to finish off, quickly show you some indicative material about what the roadmap might look like. So taking the 7 areas of the activity that we talked about, we can split them down in this way. Net zero does need to be broken down into at least these categories. So that's partly why it's a challenging set of issues for the industry. And we're looking at the kind of, in principle, the kind of commitments, targets that are set out here. The numbers of the years are in square brackets because they're not things that the task force has agreed on at this stage. So don't take these as gospel that that's what we're going to end up with. But I think we all recognise that there's a lot of impetus to make progress as quickly as we reasonably can. And I think it's been encouraging for us that nobody's really challenging the fact that we need to address these issues. The questions are much more about the practicalities of how we do it, how do we tackle the barriers, and how do we engage other sectors of the economy where we need to do that. I haven't really got time to go through all this, but I think I hope that's a useful illustration of the kind of things that we're looking at that highest level of the roadmap. And we're very open to continuing feedback on how we can improve on that. And then sitting behind that, we will look to put in place more detailed planning for the individual objectives and work streams that are captured by the top level roadmap. And this again is not finalised, but it's just illustrative of the kind of thinking that we're going through, where we would integrate existing government targets, potential targets and commitments, preconditions for action, enabling actions. And I think that one of the most important aspects of this work, from my point of view, as it's developing, is actually clearly identifying what those enabling actions and activities are, and who we need to work with to resolve them in the kind of timescales and sequence necessary to achieve the commitments and the target dates. So that's roughly what we're looking to achieve. I just wanted to give you that very quick overview of what we're looking to do. I'm very happy to talk to people offline about any more detail on that we can't cover today, but I hope that's useful as a starting point for the discussions this afternoon. And I'll stop sharing my screen at that point.
That's great. Thank you very much, John. Really good scene setting the context and some of the ambitions for the years and decades to come. I'm going to move swiftly on to, let me share my screen, sorry, I'm multitasking, to Ian Heisman, Director of Sustainability at Taylor Wimpey. Going to give us a few minutes on their approach to net zero. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, James, and thank you very much for inviting me today. So I'm going to talk about our environment strategy. Now, Taylor Wimpey's been a decent environmental performer over a number of years. We benchmark well. We've got some good achievements. For example, we've decarbonised our operations by 43% on an intensity basis since over the last sort of 7 years. But the world's changing, and it's changing fast, and we realise that we really need a big step up in this space. So at the beginning of the year, we committed to setting a science-based target, and we committed to producing an environment strategy. And the environment strategy needs to achieve a number of things. First of all, it needs to make a real difference in the areas that matter to the environment. needs to have a number of targets based on science and evidence. It needs to resonate with our key stakeholders, with investors, within customers, be accessible to our people, and demonstrate the business benefits of environmental action, and future-proof us against the regulation that's been coming in. So we went through a significant exercise, and we looked at a long list of environmental issues, much like the HBF. We condensed that down to 7, then 4, then finally 3, and we've got an environment strategy that's based on 3 pillars. First off, climate change, which I'll talk about last because that's the main focus of our session today. But I'll just mention the other 2 pillars first very briefly. First off, our second pillar was nature, and nature is being driven quite significantly by biodiversity net gain. For those of you who may not know that, that's leaving the site in a better state for nature at the end of development than it was in the beginning. But we needed to move beyond regulation. So in Taylor Wimpey, we're looking to level up our approach on species and provide species enhancements above regulation, above planning requirements. Now, I can't share those with you in detail yet because our strategy is not published, but as a flavour, we're looking to enhance both areas for nature and species to live and provide food sources for those species. In addition, in our nature pillar, we're looking to engage our customers with nature. We know that health and well-being is related to living in a natural, naturally enjoyable environment. So we're linking up in partnerships with NGOs, looking to provide nature benefits to our customers through an offering. The third pillar was around resources and waste, and this covered quite a range of different subject areas. So some traditional resource reduction targets on construction waste, on water, on plastics. We're looking to develop a towards zero waste strategy. We're looking to put water butts in gardens, look at the environmental impact of our materials, and we've already started to measure indoor and outdoor air quality. We're also looking to help our customers recycle more. So we've got some strong commitments coming up, but I'm going to now focus on our carbon pillar, our climate pillar. So the core of that is around science-based targets. We've committed to them, and they're currently, with Science-Based Targets Initiative, undergoing the verification process. So in the next few weeks, we'll get that back, and hopefully at the beginning of next year, we'll make a public commitment there. But our science-based targets, for those who may not know what they are, they're commitments in line with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We've done quite a lot of quantitative work to look at how our carbon sits in the organisation. And the way it sits is our operational emissions from our building sites and from our offices only constitute about 1% of our value chain emissions, 99% in our scope 3. And that's dominated by materials with fewer emissions from our homes in use. In relation to our science-based target commitments, there'll need to be some significant changes on our building sites. So we've already looked to reduce energy through the purchase of green electricity. We've done lots of monitoring, including very detailed monitoring of electricity. We're going to do very detailed monitoring of gas oil and diesel use. We've designed some eco-specification cabins, put in some behaviour change for energy management, but we've got more to do to meet our science-based targets. In relation to our scope 3 targets, actually the Future Home Standard does the majority of the heavy lifting on our homes in use aspect of our science-based targets, with a 75 to 80% reduction by 2025. And then in relation to our emissions, that's a matter of tracking the individual efforts in our supply chain and engaging with our supply chain where we need to make further inroads into our supply chain carbon. So we've got commitments out to 2025 and 2030 on science-based targets. But in parallel with that, we've also done work on what's called scenario analysis. And scenario analysis is looking at what the future will look like. And we looked at 3 specific climate scenarios. One where the world meets the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the relative amount of climate change is quite moderate. One where we completely blow it and there's sort of runaway climate change. We very much focused our attention on what we felt was the most likely scenario, which we called a disruptive scenario whereby the UK puts in a high level of regulation, and so we need to manage that regulatory aspect. But in addition, the world doesn't get its act quite that well together in terms of managing climate change. So we've got physical climate change parameters as well. So sort of high regulation and moderate physical parameter scenario. We looked at the risks and opportunities that were there in relation to that. In relation to risks, big risks on the regulation side from a house builder's perspective. So stricter planning requirements, the Future Home Standard gives us big challenges, EVs, electrical infrastructure, etc. Some big risks if we don't act in relation to our key customers and stakeholders, and some physical risks that will come our way, and a couple of those have been mentioned, things like flooding, overheating and things like that. In terms of opportunities, there's a massive opportunity in terms of stakeholders. Investors have made a real change, a real leap in recent months in relation to climate, and we need to align with their requirements. Customers are starting to factor it into their thinking in relation to homes, green mortgages, brand and marketing differentiation potential. So there's some great upsides in acting on climate. And there's also some upsides in technology. Things like increased use of timber frame can be a win-win. At Taylor Wimpey, we've been considering some zero scenarios in terms of homes and in terms of operations, and those are still ongoing, those considerations. So we've not made a public commitment to zero to date, but that conversation is very much alive. So in conclusion, we're making a big step up on environment. Climate is probably the biggest part of that, and we're looking forward to making some good progress in this space.
Super. Many thanks, Ian. That was a very good overview and quite a lot of detail as well about what Taylor Wimpey's doing. Wonderful. I'm going to move on swiftly to our next speaker, Sarah Pratt, Head of Corporate Sustainability at Barratt Developments. Over to you, Sarah. I'll drop down on the slides. There's your first slide.
Perfect. Thanks very much, James. And thank you again for inviting us to speak today. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, which will sound very similar to some of the stuff that Ian has talked about too, about our approach to carbon, which I suppose is reassuring for many of you, because we all will be sort of speaking with the same voice really in terms of what we're doing on carbon going forward. I'll also give you a little bit of a flavour of what we've been doing in relation to engagement with government, which came out quite strongly in the poll as well, so that hopefully will be of interest. So we've had a strategy for a number of years where we've focused on being the leading national sustainable house builder, and it's an ongoing process, and obviously we embed this through our business and operations. And we also talked already to our suppliers through our supplier conference, which we held virtually in July. It was due to be in March, but we had to postpone. And we actually shared these carbon ambitions with our supply chain at that point. So back in January this year, we actually announced our science-based carbon reduction targets, which, as Ian has very eloquently said, are in line with the Paris Agreement. So this is what scientists say we need to do to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So these are some of the areas, and very much exactly the same as Taylor Wimpey. We've got a very small direct footprint, but in our supply chain and the homes in use, you can see where there is significant carbon emissions. So we've made commitments that have been signed off by the Science Based Target Initiative, and that has helped us to have conversations about the types of things that we need to be doing, both directly on our construction sites, but also in working with yourselves in the supply chain and opening up opportunities for low carbon opportunities in the future. So there are further targets that sit alongside this, being net zero in our own operations by 2040, sourcing 100% of electricity which we use on our sites and in our offices, sales offices and show homes. Those will be sourced from renewable sources by 2025. And then the net zero target for our homes from 2030. So you can see where the balance of the footprint sits, and a lot of work therefore needs to be done collectively right across our organisations collaboratively together, which is, I think, one of the very good reasons why the school is acting as a very good convener for this session today. So we've got some immediate priorities. I think one of the things that was touched on earlier on in the poll as well is around information and data. So we need to get more accurate carbon data, particularly by working with our partners in the supply chain. So we'll be working with our suppliers to look at scope 1 and 2 data, particularly from high intensity suppliers. And then in our own operations, we know that about 60% of that 1% is using from diesel use from fossil fuels. So that's something where we need to get our arms around what do we do about that over the long term. And there'll be interesting innovations that we'll be able to use in due course, but I think it's what's the immediate things that we can do now that we need to move on. And then in our operations as well, we're looking at what we're doing around resource efficiency, waste, and starting to understand some of the end-to-end issues with things like packaging wastes on our sites also. So there will be many different challenges and opportunities here that we'll need to set up specific working groups, because there are going to be things where we will need to kind of work together, put aside some of the competitive challenges, but obviously really harness the innovation and competitive nature of everybody in the supply chain also. I think some of the challenges that we all face, which I think you've all raised in the poll, will only be realised through having the right policy environment in place. So I think if you flip to the next slide, James, we wanted to just share a little bit about the work that we've been doing with investors and the government. So we've been having a lot of conversations around this, and I guess very much mirroring some of the conversations that John was talking about with the HBF. There is a huge groundswell of intent, and I think the challenge is converting that goodwill, enthusiasm in a way that we can all put our shoulder to the wheel and all focus on commitment for a real lasting legacy for the whole sector. So we've been busy focusing on 4 main areas really. So a clear interconnected plan. Now this is around not just carbon but also all the other aspects which we can deliver through having a clear and consistent approach. We want to focus on something that's simple but consistent, that everybody can work to with consistent definitions. So we've been talking about around those challenges, and particularly proud of the work that we've done as a business with the Net Zero APPG, and some of you have seen that they launched their Decarbonisation Report last week, and that sets out 10 clear recommendations around the sustainable economy and green jobs that wider than the house building sector. So there is a wider government agenda which this all fits into. Some of you also in the poll mentioned building confidence in the supply chain. So I think possibly, understandably, there's a lack of confidence in some areas, particularly where there may be uncertainty about the policy environment going forward. So what we want to ensure is that we limit that fragmentation and support a call for government to meet policies that will help with volume demand for green solutions, so that we aren't limited in terms of the speed and scale of delivery that's required to meet some of the climate challenges. So this really needs to be focused around legislative certainty, clarity over helping us as developers be clear about the investments, and really levelling the playing field, so that there is a clear opportunity for people to be flexible within the regulations, but actually ensure that we have parity with all of our competitors and things like land buying, so supporting the right sorts of stimulus packages and incentives, so that in the supply chain you have the opportunity to innovate at the scale that's required. You mentioned, I think, also skills shortages. So there is obviously a challenge there in terms of what's needed and the scale of what's needed over time, and knowledge was another area that was focused on. So we were delighted to hear about the announcement last week and to be part of the Green Jobs Task Force, which was part of the government's ambition to create 2 million green jobs by 2030. So I think that shows a level of ambition and sense of direction that is positive also. One of the other things that we're all collectively being extremely conscious of is public awareness and acceptability of new technology. And so, because, as you've seen, a proportion of our emissions come from homes in use, we also need to ensure that there is public acceptance of new technologies, new ways of doing things. So I think some of that is about trusted information, ensuring that there are clear incentives, and I think it was Ian mentioned it, around green mortgages and aligning that sort of benefit for the opportunity for supporting greener and more sustainable homes. So the agenda's moving on fast, and I think wider than the government agenda also, it's coming from investors. So we're seeing a huge amount more interest from investors over the last 12, 18 months. And I think within our business, that's been where the real driver has come from, in terms of not just the regulatory pressure, but also the investors being aligned with that. So Ian mentioned the scenario analysis that they've been doing, and the work that we're all, as listed companies, be doing in responding to the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Yet another acronym for us to get our mouths around. So TCFD, we're mandated by 2025. So we need to be aligning ourselves in our reporting and our risk assessment processes. So this is stuff that will be embedded in the business. So I think that should give confidence to people working with us that this is something that the business is extremely serious about, because of the alignment of drivers. So there are lots of opportunities for innovation. I think lots of opportunities for working together and sharing information, and a very exciting but equally challenging time ahead.
Super. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was really good, really interesting. In the desire to move on in the agenda, I'm going to move over to Andrew Day, Sustainability Director at Telford Homes. Andrew, we've got your slides. Would you like me to drive them from here?
If you can, please, James. I would like that's fine. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope we're well. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. There's obviously been a lot of ground covered by our earlier speakers. So rather than repeating some of that ground, I'll just give some highlights and insights in how our 2030 net zero carbon strategy responds to our trading environment. Just before I do that, this is half the slide of our 2030 scenario. We undertook a materiality review when we set up this strategy. We engaged with clients, build to rent, affordable homes providers, and also internally within our executive. So whilst our business is primarily focused on build to rent in the London space, we still undertake a lot of affordable homes, still open market, and we're also looking outside the London space as well. But nonetheless, we look at 4 key principles. Living legacy, it's about creating place. Balanced resources, that's around a lighter environmental footprint. Creative building solutions, that's how we put our schemes together. And then how the fourth pillar is being a smart business. That's around governance, that's around transparency, and how we work with our supply chain, and also how we can work through advocacy. Because the reality is, whilst there's a lot of convergence in this space, it's a complicated space, it's a challenging space, and we cannot undertake this work by ourselves. So one of the calls that I'd make to the group around the table today is, how can we work together? We don't know all the answers at the moment, but we do think through collaboration, we stand a good chance of meeting some really, really tough challenges looking out to the future. So for us, we've got these various references in colours, and just before the reference, there is an M1 or an M2. That's referring to our materiality review and our risk register and how we undertake these particular aspects. We're communicating to institutional investors, whether it's equity, whether it's debt, whether it's our customers, whether it's our planning environment, all the way through to our supply chain. So what we've tried to do over the last 2 years is to understand the communication lines and actually try and speak in a language that's understandable, because this can get incredibly technical. So in terms of the high level around living legacy in 2020 to 2021, we're benchmarking our biodiversity net positive schemes. We're doing some at this point in time. We have tested and trialled home quality mark to level 4. So we're reasonably comfortable we can push in that direction. We're particularly focused on our wellbeing strategy. That was in a pre-COVID world, but obviously far more of importance in a post-COVID world. We're looking at circular economy. So all our schemes now have circular economy statements. We're looking out to zero waste to landfill by 2024. Like others who have spoken, we have a science-based target and TCFD commitment. We're currently working on our roadmaps. This year, we're targeting a 40% reduction in regulated carbon. Hopefully, we'll get there. We're just a bit shy at the moment. We've actually achieved a 16% reduction in water use, which is very positive. We're using CIBSE guidance TM59 to manage overheating in our buildings. We are developing a whole life cost model, and that's incredibly challenging and very difficult given there's many, many different metrics being used in London and various other spaces. But we are working with UK Green Building Council and the Whole Life Cost Network to understand how we can deliver consistency across our business and take a sectorial view, because ultimately this is going to feed into science-based targets and TCFD. For our business, 93% of our carbon footprint is through the buildings that we build. So the other percent, scope 1 and 2, is our offices, our car fleets, and what we call housekeeping. But the big challenge is how we break down our embodied carbon. And part of that, with concrete frame, multi-storey buildings, is pretty carbon intensive. So looking forward to the future, UK Green Building Council recent publication means 2025, potentially those buildings are going to have to be steel frame buildings. From 2030, potentially those buildings could be CLT and timber frame. And L&G have done a really smart piece of work where they're developing 20-storey buildings in London, build to rent, demonstrating how this can be done. But there is a cost premium and there is a challenge premium associated with each of those points. So we're under no illusions at the size of the challenge that's ahead of us. And again, looking forward, it's how we manage that challenge as a collaborative. James, could you just quickly flick on to the second part of the slide? Thank you very much. You'll notice here from 2022 out to 25, Future Home Standard, the interim report, and we're then seeing a cluster of objectives, as John's outlined in his initial presentation, and how we start dealing with some of those challenges. So BREEAM excellence would have to be standard. Social value and being social value positive is part of that. In 22-23, we're looking at an embodied carbon and 10% reduction. We're then looking at creating air quality neutral schemes in that same period. A much greater focus around MMC, but we think that's perhaps up to about 20%. We're not so sure it's going to be on the 20% period. We're looking at well standard and what that means in terms of not just the air quality in the surrounding buildings, but also the interiors and the places that we're creating, which is going to become ever more challenging. From 25 onwards, we're looking at a 20% reduction in embodied carbon, then into late 20s, a 30 to 40% reduction in embodied carbon. And those are going to be very, very stiff challenges that we need to meet. So we've started some analysis work, and early in the new year, we'll be benchmarking schemes, a low, medium, high story scheme using traditional brickwork, precast and unitized, to understand what our benchmarks are and how we relate those benchmarks to science-based targets, TCFD, and ultimately is how we offset that carbon tariff. So we'd like to offset as little as possible, but of course we do realise there is a residual offset there that cannot be achieved on site, so we're going to have to offset. So again, working with peers in understanding what carbon offset might look like in that period. Then ultimately out to 2030, where the UN and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are set to, there's a whole bunch of hard stops that we will be working to. In between times, we're going to carry on with our ESG analysis of our peers, of our competitors, of our investors, future stakeholders and co-investors. And if we can accelerate some of these objectives, then we'll do so by sharing risk. But we think this is a very holistic, integrated approach, which covers off the elements of the National Future Home Standard. But in between time, there's some further work we want to do around green finance, which has been mentioned by both Sarah and Ian at the back end of their presentations. James, very conscious of time, I'm happy to stop at that point so we can get some further presentations and Q&As, if that's okay.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Yes,
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you to the 4 speakers so far. We're going to have a short session of panel Q&A with the 4 speakers that we've heard already, with John, Ian, Sarah and Andrew. If you do have any questions from the audience, do send them through on the chat box. I'll try and manipulate those as well as we're going along, see those too. But to start off, John, can I come to you first of all, please? We've talked a little bit about government policy, but what are the big things that you think we need to see changing in government policy to encourage the drive that's needed that the 4 of you have talked about?
Thanks, James. Well, we need a clear sense of direction in terms of what the government wants to see happen, certainly for housing. And you know, we do have the Future Home Standard in the carbon field, but we're very aware that we need to go beyond that. So one of the things that we're talking about in our current work is, what does that pathway look like beyond the 2025 standard to get to net zero? And as I try to indicate in my slides, not just for currently regulated emissions, but also for unregulated and embodied carbon. So some big challenges there. I guess overall our philosophy is that we'd like the industry, and I don't just mean house building, but the industry collectively and other actors, as far as possible, to come up with the solutions and the timescales themselves, which we can get government comfortable with. It's perhaps too easy to say that regulation is the answer to everything. It's certainly going to be the answer to some key things, but I don't think we want to do more regulation than we absolutely need. So I think our hope is that we can work with other sectors to come up with credible strategies and timelines to achieve particular goals. And it's going to be important to understand what pathways they're on, so what pathways the manufacturers on, the energy sectors on, and so forth, in order to put all this together. But I think regulation and policy is only part of the picture. We need to do quite a bit of this ourselves.
Well, thank you, John. Ian, there's a question I'd like to put your way, based on some of the information that you were providing and other people as well, about the carbon impact in the use phase of the life cycle, in effect, the homeowner being about 1/3 of the footprint. How do we influence our customers, in your view, to operate and use their houses more efficiently? How do we bring that side of things down?
Well, I think we need to emphasise the opportunity that zero carbon homes offer customers, or low carbon, low energy homes. So the obvious one is the running costs. They're cheaper to run. But there are also potential benefits in terms of increased thermal comfort and more uniform interior temperature. And low carbon lifestyles are starting to become more attractive to customers, and there's some opportunities around green mortgages, and Barclays offer a green mortgage currently. But there's also a requirement to rise to the challenges for customers, because of course there's going to be challenges there as well, some unintended consequences potentially in terms of overheating and indoor air quality and condensation, things like that. There's potential challenges around maintenance and breakdown of green technologies, particularly the more complex one, the obvious thing being inverters in PV, the payback periods for green tech. But probably really key for customers is simple operation. You can put green tech in there, but if it's complicated to work, it won't go down well, it won't be well received. So I think there's a really interesting role for technology there as to how to operate a house in a very complex way, but with a very simple customer interface. I think there's also challenges around marketing. So currently customers like a boiler because they understand how to use it, and they like a gas cooker, but we'll have to market houses that have a heat pump and have an electric cooker. So that's some marketing challenges for us. But I think in the round there are some great opportunities, but we have to also overcome the challenges for our customers.
Thank you, Ian. Sarah, picking up on from there where that leaves off, we've talked a lot about the Future Home Standard. It sounds like it might be lauded to be something that's going to save us all. Is that the case, or is it just a bit part in the solution? How it's going to bring forward reductions in energy use and more efficiency when it eventually comes out?
Well, I think everybody's touched on the fact that this is part of a much wider story. So it's key in terms of it helps all of us align in terms of the delivery that's needed to get us on a path to achieving the Paris climate commitment that the government's made. I guess what we also need, though, is to be focused on the other aspects. So I think John sort of alluded to it, but there are some key aspects of knowing what the flight path is going to be with things like the Environment Bill, for example, which we need certainty around what's happening in relation to biodiversity net gain, waste and resources strategy. All of these things are tied in together, so it's very much about how these things all weave together. And I think although it is only part of the story, that's certainly going to help provide that certainty for everybody about the trajectory and the direction that we all need to go in. So I think there is a real opportunity to focus on the kind of practical aspects of delivery, design, etc., that we need to do, which is a huge task for the whole industry alone in terms of delivering a Future Home Standard. But I think it is one part of the bigger jigsaw.
Cool. Thank you, Sarah. Andrew, I'm going to come to you with a tough question, or a very tough question posed by the audience. In terms of the potential additional cost of lower carbon solutions, some of the questions have been about how that is dealt with, how that is not passed on to the homeowner, or how that is absorbed within the value of the building and the price of the house. How are house builders and wider stakeholders looking to manage that concern about environmental costs more?
Yeah, okay. So thanks for that, James, and fully understands that the challenge. I'm going to slightly sidestep that one, but I will give a view. For us, our key interest is build to rent, institutional investors. So we are seeing a very strong move from a CapEx model to an OpEx model, whereby the running costs, which are substantially more in the longer term, are key to that proposition. So we're having some really interesting embryonic conversations with those investors who are investing to long term. We, as you've heard from all the speakers, science-based targets, TCFD, there is going to be an emphasis on how we invest in all of our assets, whether it's a commercial real estate asset or whether it's a retail asset. And I'm using that language because speaking with various banks, that's how they're looking. And by way of example, I'll give an example of NatWest Bank, who we work very closely from a debt and equity perspective. They've recently launched a green mortgage like others, which is a discount and to the market for an A and B rated home. So the new homes market, that gives us real difference and real differential, because typically we are building A and B rated homes, EPC ratings. We suspect, and we're hearing strong insights, that those challenges are going to increase. And in future, banks, institutional investors will be setting their own net zero carbon targets, which will benefit those homes that have more sustainability built into them. So I think there's market move, but the reality is there is an additional cost premium. And again, I'm going to refer to UK Green Building Council report on net zero carbon. To get from where we are today, multi-storey apartment blocks in London, to 2025, it's up to a 5% premium. It could be a bit less, but it's up to a 5% premium. And then from 25 up to 2030, there's probably a similar premium. But the reality is, I think there's optimism, as Ian set out, and as Sarah's reflected, as John as well, that we do have a sense and a direction of travel that's moving ahead. And I think with government looking towards and looking beyond not just GDP, but green GDP, I think the market is actually starting to coalesce and converge. And we think in London and other places there's starting to be some acceleration in this space. Hopefully that answered the question.
Super. Thank you, Andrew. Conscious of time, so I'm going to ask three or four more very quick questions. I want very short answers, please, where possible. Taking questions from the audience. Is carbon considered in procurement? I'm going to go to Ian first of all on that one. How does procurement and commercial considerations take into account carbon?
Sure, I can speak for ourselves. So in terms of measurement, we use this thing called input-output modelling, where you convert spend into carbon in order to assess your procurement carbon. We're then moving on to a couple of other things after that. We're doing some pilots on EPCs, on energy performance, sorry, not EPC, environmental product declarations, EPDs, on a couple of sites to try to look at embodied carbon there. And so we're going to then look towards modifying our modelling. So it's very much in the measurement phase. In terms of the action phase, we've embedded lots of carbon questions in our process for procuring from our central procurement services, and therefore we're going to start to collect information on how our suppliers are working. At the moment, we're pretty much focused on our central procurement colleagues and our commercial colleagues in the 24 business units. We're still sort of thinking of strategies to engage with them. So it's early days, and we're looking at the big ticket items first.
Cool. Super. Thank you, Ian. Sarah, products sourced from within the UK or from overseas? Which is there a right and a wrong? Loaded question.
Loaded question. I mean, I suppose one of the things that I suppose is a strong point with our kind of supply chain is that many of the products are sourced in the UK, and that is our preference. So we would not unless it's under extreme sort of conditions or supply constraints, look to be sourcing materials from overseas. But there are obviously elements that we do pull in. All of these different decisions will have going forward. I think across all of us, we will be looking with a much more finer tooth comb at all of these things than we have done. And I think that's the honest kind of situation is that it will be a huge driver going forward. These things will be a key part of decision making. But as it stands, UK sourcing is positive. I think one of the challenges is where you get materials and where the right places are to get the right materials for the job that you need. So we will source a lot of our timber from Scandinavia, and that northern Scandinavia, and the reasons for that are that's the best quality timber for the job that's in hand. So that wouldn't necessarily be a UK sourced material. But obviously, if you're looking for bricks, etc., you've got a huge, very positive supply chain which we would support in the UK.
Super. Thank you, Sarah. And then last question to Andrew about offsetting. A couple of the audience have talked about offsetting and whether that's in scope or whether it's part of that discussion or not, and if so, how?
It's most definitely in scope. We're working with UK Green Building Council at the moment to understand quality, credibility of offset, the price of offset, whether it's the London plan, £60, £95 a tonne, and what the trajectory is out to 25, out to 2030. picking up on Sarah's point about onshore, offshore procurement, our view is we'd rather onshore offset, but there is a space there to be worked through. So fascinating to see what government has to say in this space in Building Back Green. Obviously anticipating announcements later this week. May not be picking up offsets, but offset is very much part of the proposition going forward.
Cool, thank you, Andrew. I realise there's been lots and lots of questions. Thank you everybody from the audience, and unfortunately we don't have time to answer all of them, of course. I've seen some great questions on the skills agenda, on closed loop and circular economy. Clearly there's a link, particularly around embodied carbon, between the energy, the materials we use, what we dispose of, and being efficient and lean with that, as well as other questions about why is net zero being set relatively far in the future. We'll try and cover some of these questions today, of course, but also there will be other opportunities to answer them. I'm going to move on and ask Tom Robinson next to come up to the lectern, or the virtual lectern. Tom is Managing Director at Adaptivate, and will be giving a presentation on some of their innovative low carbon products. So I'm just going to stop sharing, Tom. You can share your slides when you're ready. That's great. You're still on mute, but we can see your slides.
There we are.
Super.
So I have a confession to make right from the start, which is I used to be a builder, working on site. I got so fed up with working on site and all that the industry was sort of throwing, and the waste, and really just not really seeing much change. I decided to sort of take matters into my own hands a little bit, and went to go and study a master's in sustainable architecture, and developed a composite, a biocomposite that could work towards replacing wallboard. So Adaptivate is a company that is set up to essentially turn finite materials into renewable materials, using biomaterials for materials that are drop-in products to the current materials that we use. We are driven by international scalability, and we are the leaders in taking these fibrous composites and putting them into industrial processes. And it's great to be able to share some of this work with you guys, as we are at a really interesting time in our industry. We take a holistic approach. We come from, I come from a practical on-site experience. So the ease of installation, some of the things that people are talking about the skills and public acceptance, that was really important in the design of our materials. The health of people in the buildings and the health of the building, and taking CO2 and resource efficiency into account as well. And so the wallboard industry and the construction industry itself has a real interesting challenge around feedstocks, about feedstock security, resource security. Evidently, waste is a big issue as well, and what happens to products when they get thrown away. And also, when we spend 90% of our time in buildings, whether that's at work or at home or whatever, that's really important to consider our health in these buildings that we're performing, that we're living in. So our products are, third largest building product used in the world is wallboard. It accounts for the same CO2 as the aviation industry. And we have a direct drop-in alternative to that has some performance benefits in terms of breathability, in terms of reducing condensation and mold, thermal performance, acoustic performance. It's made from renewable feedstocks, of course, being bio. And I'm going to go into the carbon element in more detail later on. The second material we have is breather plaster, which is currently on the market. Has a lot of the benefits of the board, but is of course they form a compatible system. This is a product that's CE marked, currently sold actually across the world now, and A1 fire rating. Bag plaster. We have lots of gypsum plasters that pick it up and love it. And has the same setting times as a standard gypsum plaster, but the performance benefits that I was just sharing with you. So let's have a look at CO2 in a bit more detail. We understand that 10% of the UK's carbon emissions can be attributed to heating of buildings. Around 60% of the country's waste is from construction, and both embodied and operational carbon accounts for 22% of the emissions. What's more is that these targets are becoming increasingly pressing, and there are lots of different ways, and operational energy is obviously a key part of it, but also so is the materials that we build our houses from. And one of the things that we're really challenged with is around the perceptions of the zero carbon future. How do we actually deliver this? Especially when you see some news items like this morning from the Grenfell disaster and what trust is put into materials that we build our houses from. What we can also see from the UK Green Building Council, and I was pleased to hear that was referenced earlier from Andrew, they're doing some great work on this, and really what we can see is as time develops and goes on, operational carbon is going to drastically improve, placing a greater importance on embodied carbon. And how do we get the fabric of what we build our buildings out of to actually enable us to really draw in that carbon? And the Green Building Council have done a great study into this. What they basically say is that the scale for opportunity to influence embodied carbon is the most when we brief and design these buildings. And the Part L has done a good point in regulations. Most of the government focus and the private sector focus has been about how do we improve our buildings is through modern methods of construction and off-site manufacturing, and that's good. But what do we build them out of, and how can we actually, that is the biggest opportunity to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and put them into buildings and lock it up for 10, 20 years or longer, And what happens to the waste? What happens, EPDs have been mentioned, where do we measure our EPDs to? What are the boundary conditions, and what happens to them after their life? So we use biomaterials mainly because they're lighter, they lock carbon into fabric, they breathe with the people in the building. So they reduce this problem with condensation and mold, but they also absorb volatile organic compounds. They're renewable, they're compostable, and they have international applicability. And so a typical material flow for normal materials is finite materials go into a CO2 emitting production process into a building that has a CO2 kind of emission and VOCs, and then it goes to waste. So it's very linear. And so what we do at Adaptivate is think about this differently. And we're funded at the moment, we have a project with the Innovate UK, co-funded by the Innovate UK, which is really looking into how we take plants, put them into, that take in CO2. We put them into our industrial process, which actually absorbs CO2 from foundation industries, but also from the atmosphere. And we can lock CO2 into our process, and we can put the products into buildings. In buildings, our products actually continue to absorb CO2. Instead of throwing them away, what we're doing with this project is looking at putting our waste materials into an energy process, which gives us energy to fuel factories or houses, but it also gives us a leachate to be able to put on the crops, to be able to grow more materials of the future, therefore completely closing this loop in an industrial process that's incredibly scalable. And so what's really important to avoid maladaptation is this area where we can really build practicality into the offering, as well as health, as well as really locking down this CO2. And whilst building a good community, and of course, looking at the business case for these offerings. So if we look into the health benefits a little bit more, because when we get focused on one thing, we often forget, other areas. Of course, what about the health of these buildings and the people that live within them? Well, our materials and biomaterials broadly have the ability to improve thermal performance and therefore U values. But they also have this ability, they have a capillary structure, which enables them to act like lungs on the inside of the building. And so whilst the building fabric might not be breathable, what you can do is use your materials to absorb and desorb the moisture that's created in the building, around 14 litres a day for an average family, which is kind of mind-blowing, really. And these materials passively regulate. So when we're looking for tech solutions that are not needing people to use them, Materials are a great way to lower energy, improve thermal comfort, improve health, without the need for people to know what's going on. And of course, the installation was a massive point. Coming from on site and being a plasterboarder and plasterite, they needed to be direct drop-in solutions. And so our materials are, used and installed in exactly the same way. They're specified in the same way. We renovated part of the UK Green Building Council renovation project. And our plaster's used to really improve health and performance, but also really give plasterers and builders an alternative product to use without having to reskill or retrain. And that's when we can really unlock the market as well, is where that barrier is reduced. And then we have some cool projects which are like, groovy members clubs in Mayfair and stuff like that, where sustainability is a real key part of what they offer. And that enables us to, I think it was Ian talking about marketing, and about how the message of our materials has actually primarily been health and performance to date. But now we are really focused on being the leading material manufacturer and developer in carbon negative building materials. And so we go back to the reason why I set the business up, was to lock carbon into the fabric of the buildings. And so we know that the house builders and construction industry, it has increasing pressures, and we know that they're not really going away. And we know that they have economic implications, and that there's large barriers to entry from first-hand experience. There's large barriers to entry to getting new products onto the market, no matter how good you think they are and that they're independently verified. And we're working with the BRE at the moment to independently verify our EPD tool, so we can actually develop materials with our own tool that's independently verified to actually intentionally design carbon negative building materials that are on industrial processes. And the materials are there, but how do we work together to be able to get them into the market and get widespread uptake? And so the opportunities lie around the fact that these materials are out there and those technologies are out there. We're in broad concurrence about that. And it's mentioned a number of times, raw materials are a big risk. Challenge, the opportunities is around collaboration and innovation. And really, the answers may not be overnight, but we need market leaders to build relationships so that solutions are there in line with your roadmaps. And it was great to see Andrew's really well thought out roadmap where it balances well-being along carbon and alongside a load of other stuff. And so really, I have a very clear opportunity for everyone here today, which is we are looking at building a community that enables us to, and we're interested in talking to stakeholders around, we are developing and will launch carbon negative products in the next year. And that will be a focus of ours. And we are interested in talking to companies and organizations that are interested in leading the way with us, and possibly partly in blended public and private finance, to really pilot these materials, to give us feedback, and to really have the opportunity to inform the carbon negative building materials that can be used in buildings of the future together. So as a little bit of a joke, the new construction news that I've created this morning, Adaptivate and your company could be leading the way to a low carbon negative future. Thanks very much for the opportunity, James. And I really do welcome anyone reaching out after this that this resonates with. Thanks.
Super. Thank you very much, Tom. Really inspiring to hear about carbon negative. I don't think it's been decided yet. Is it carbon positive, part carbon negative? But
I'll leave that
yes,
to decide. Yeah.
Someone clever than me can put a definition on that. Thank you very much, Tom. So last but not least, we've got Joanne Wilkins from Aggregate Industries. If you want to swap around the sharing of your respective slides between you, that'd be great. And over to you. Just while you're getting set up. There we go. So yeah, Joanne's going to talk to us about green concrete, yeah, over to you.
Sorry, I was still on mute, which isn't very helpful, is it? Let me pull this slideshow up and hopefully everybody can see. Can everybody see? Can you see the slide, James, or can you see the?
We can see the slides. We can see the one where you're sharing the next slide in your notes.
Okay, let me see if I can do this the other way around. This isn't very helpful, seeing as we're running behind a little bit. Let's try again. Screen 2. Share. And then if I press this. Is that the right way around, James? Okay. I hope so. Yes. Okay.
All good.
I can
yep.
see some nodding. Fabulous. Sorry. So yeah. So I will give a bit of a whistle-stop tour, looking at 3 different aspects with regards to our conversation today. So the first one is that we'll focus on how everyone in the supply chain is needed to deliver this target of net zero, touching on how even one of the biggest contributors to CO2, cement and so concrete, are already launching low carbon product ranges, and how if Lafarge Holcim can be brave enough to deliver a net zero 2030 pledge using the science-based targets, then so can the rest of the housing sector. So we've heard today already from 3 of our sector's biggest players, with the housing sector and us alone. Construction across the disciplines and the sectors are all looking to reduce the lasting impact they have when building, from local authority pledges, major projects and contractor promises, to government enshrining change in law. We understand one of the reasons why Heathrow has been delayed, and that's that legal challenge in the Supreme Court due to the project falling short of them UK commitments to the Paris Agreement. Whichever way we turn in construction, the environmental impacts are becoming more and more important. And this is great for lots of reasons, one of which is because it increases the appetite across construction, which will drive that innovation and change, so that all of that innovation and change can be drawn upon by all of the sectors. Concrete, surprisingly, has one of the lowest per tonne carbon footprints than most other construction materials, as calculated by the embodied carbon of building materials chart developed by the Institute of Carbon and Energy. Concrete has a lower kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of material than timber, 0.1 in concrete versus 0.3 in timber. The reason it has such a different reputation, not a worse reputation, but a different one, is due to the sheer volume of concrete that we use. It's one of the many challenges we must overcome to support this drive for net zero. For this reason, and many more, the building materials sector are rising to the challenge and developing new ways to help. At Aggregate Industries, we've launched 2 of our new low carbon ranges. The first one is within our asphalt business, which is our super low project, and that has carbon neutral asphalt range. And then we have the one in concrete, which is EcoPact. It's a globally developed product range that helps customers to reach their environmental targets. However, it needs more than a product range, and so we've developed the concrete carbon commitments and our carbon calculator, which can be used as a low carbon product selector, all of which you'll find on the website. So the carbon commitments look to focus on a reduce strategy. We'll support the industry by making sure that we've got the right concrete that's selected at the design phase. To do that, we need to make sure that we understand where that knowledge is held, and that's held within our suppliers. So it's interesting that when we were doing the word clouds, we all spoke about the fact that we needed more knowledge and understanding as to where carbon is and what solutions that we have. Yet the influence for lower carbon products, the lowest level of influence was within our supply chain, whereas I think that's where most of the answers to this low carbon challenge sit. Within our carbon commitments, we also make sure that we have an optimised plant network. So we make sure that where SEM1 is required, we use the least amount of SEM1 that is needed, but in ensuring that the performance specification is still met. So this is just making sure that we have up-to-date technology use within our plant network, making sure that people are trained and competent to deliver the materials that are needed. And then that final one is just that clear product solution, meaning that you can meet the specification that's required out on site, but you have different options to be able to do it using some low carbon technology. We're also really conscious when it comes to any type of change, and Thomas touched on this really well in the previous presentation. We need to sometimes make sure that we don't always see too much change when we're innovating, because it's a little bit easier for us to accept in construction. We always do what we've always done, so we often get what we've always got, I think is one of the phrases which is spoken about often in construction. So we just need to make sure that when we are putting these solutions forward, that people understand that we are still getting that same performance. We're making sure that it's delivering that great durability, the same strength that's needed, as well as the finish that's expected out on site. You can also see the carbon calculator, and if you go to the Aggregate Industries website, you'll be able to see that in more detail. The final point I wanted to make was that if we can, housing can. So Lafarge Holcim are up there when it comes to the big CO2 emitters. It comes with the territory, unfortunately. For the world's biggest cement producer, with over 190 different cement plants globally, we produce nearly 25% of all of the cement. As well as our concrete, asphalt and ready-mix businesses, we recognise that we have to be part of the solution. And that's why in September 2019, Maglia Anderson was appointed to the board as our Chief Sustainability Officer, the first in our sector. And in 2020, we launched our Net Zero Pledge with our 2030 plan, partnered with Science Based Targets Initiative. If we can take bold steps to drive down the carbon, we know that our biggest superpower in construction is collaboration. Imagine what we can all do together. Thank you. So I made that a bit briefer, James. I hope that was okay. I know that we're tight on time.
No, that's great. Thanks, Joanne. Excellent. So if you want to stop sharing, I'll just put my slides back up. Okay, yes, I'm conscious that we're just over time. So a couple of quick questions for Tom and Joanne. Tom, if I can come to you first. Building on your presentation, how do you think we can make our supply chains robust enough so that they can truly manufacture zero carbon materials? You've obviously done some great work within Adaptivate, but how do we mainstream this?
Yeah, I think. I mean, at the risk of playing repeat, collaboration is massively important. We are busy building the value chains of the future and de-risking that as a proposition as we build a bio feedstock supply chain, so that we can produce industrial products on industrial processes at an economic price that the market can accept. What's constantly needed, especially at the moment, we sit in a really interesting opportunity space. In chaos, there's always opportunity. And right now, the government are wanting green jobs. They're wanting to reshore manufacturing. People want to buy UK products. Well, companies like Adaptivate are a UK business that have come from a UK building site that have got a thirdly, most used building product that's used worldwide. And we need the support from investment, private, public. But we also need the support from the feedback, which is why my kind of call to action, which is I genuinely want to work with people like Taylor Wimpey, like Telford, like Barrett, like people listening today, so that we can get a feedback loop about what you need from the market back to us, so that we can actually develop the carbon negative materials that are easy for you to use and available through your normal channels. So they're drop-in alternatives. And if we can form transparent, collaborative approaches like that, we're building the value chains upstream. If we can build them downstream, then we have a really powerful opportunity for us all. But it does take leaders to be able to step into this space. And that's what I'm really calling to action, is those people that want to lead, please reach out.
Cool, great. Some good keywords there around leadership and collaboration. And then, if I may, Joanne, final question for you. You were talking about cement being, particularly Lafarge Holcim, being liable, shall we say, for a lot of carbon emissions just because of the nature of what you do, and you're putting lots of active work in reducing that. But I suppose the $64 million question, is there enough low carbon or renewable energy globally to support that transition, that steady transition?
I think there's definitely more of a drive to want to move into that space, James. We're seeing it from our customers and our clients asking for lower carbon and demanding lower carbon solutions. We're also starting to see it from investors as well, and we're starting to see investment be moved from some of the big carbon emitters if they're not looking to address the emissions that they're currently sat at. We're looking to develop one of the first carbon neutral cement factories as part of one of our low carbon commitments. So it's definitely challenging. As far as we're concerned, we don't see there being any other option for us to continue to deliver a sustainable, in the sense of a long-term profitable business, as well as a sustainable from an environment perspective as well. I don't think any of us have much choice in this, James.
Okay, and that's a very good final comment to leave us with there. And that's going to segue. Thank you, Joanne. Segue into kind of rounding up from our side. So you'll have seen, everybody, that my colleague Sophie from the Supply Chain School will have put a SurveyMonkey link in the chat box. If you can, please click on that and provide us with your feedback on this event and any other kind of events that you're interested in seeing and listening to. We will be sending that round as well with the slides and the recording link from today's session. So if you don't have time now, don't worry, there will be another opportunity. I suppose for me, the final concluding summary that I've pulled from this, that I see there's a common set of issues. As Joanne has just said, we've kind of got no choice in some respects, but there's a common set of issues and a common set of goals that we're trying to achieve. And importantly, we have the technology now to achieve that, and we have the methods and the techniques to achieve that. And more will come over time, over the coming years and decades. We are an innovative race, ultimately. So taking that innovation and combining it with the collaboration that has been mentioned several times, and the knowledge and skills that we need to do that, this is achievable. We can master this, and we can change the way that we work and achieve the goals that we're trying to do. So my final action call to everyone is get involved in the Supply Chain School. The knowledge and skills piece is very much housed therein. Events like this, learning modules, you can learn yourself, teach yourself at your own pace, and do engage in more events like this. So thank you to all my speakers. Thank you for spending time with us and giving us your thoughts. Thank you to you as the audience for giving us some very good questions. We will collate those and do our best to try and answer those as well. And that's it for now. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, James.
Bye now.
Cheers. Cheers.